Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In this episode, we'll get to grips with what might seem like a simple question. Why and how did the Allies win the Second World War? The usual answer is that it was superior numbers. These do matter, but we think that the answers go far beyond the statistic. In order to get to grips with all of this, we have to lift some of the fog of war. And Jesse, that's of course exactly what we're doing here on this podcast. So it's all about myth busting and lifting this fog of war and doing a bit more than simply and merely scratching the surface. We're just chatting about this before we start recording. Did the Allies actually win the war? Of course they did. That would be a myth too far, so to speak. Not a bridge too far, but a myth too far. But obviously, it's always about the numbers. The discussion always comes down to numbers. The Germans were better, they had better men, they had better soldiers, they had better equipment, but the Allies had more of everything, and this is why they won. So if we just look at this, the numbers game, what do you think is the reality there, and how does this myth, again, let's use that word, really relate to what we see being played out between 1939 and 1945?
Right. Hello, Matthias, once again. And look, this is the kind of question that I really like, actually, because this is where a little historical investigation, a little historical sleuthing, a little critical thinking goes a long way to a better understanding of historical events or phenomena or patterns or trends, especially a massive and complex event like the Second World War. It cannot be reduced to numbers. And I'm going to speak to the numbers right off the bat here because it is important. Like this idea that it's just about numbers, it doesn't come from nowhere. There is a massive grain of salt to this exaggerated, simplified explanation that you sometimes hear online or see in whatever popular publications or discussions and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to run through a few numbers here so that we know what we're dealing with. When we get into the concepts and ideas of why it's not only numbers, we have to know some of the numbers, right? Because they're inescapable. They're very stark. So here we go. By 1944, the Allied economy of the big three, right? So let's simplify a little bit here, of the Soviets, the British Empire. Got to say empire here because we got to include people like Australia, New Zealand, Canada. They contribute significantly. The British Empire, the Soviets, and the Americans, their combined economy is 3 times larger than the combined economies of Germany, Italy, and Japan, and various and sundry Hungaries and Romanias and Slovakias and so forth. Population-wise, so if you're talking a long, complex, almost total war, the resources come from the population, in part anyway. The big three allies have a total population under their control of about 750 million people, whereas the Axis have about 250 million people. If we're talking about industrial might and how do they turn these resources into actual weapons on the battlefield, there the difference is pretty stark as well. In terms of armored vehicles, the Allies outproduce the Axis by a factor of more than 4 to 1. By artillery, the factor is by more than 4 to 1 again. And guess what? For tanks, the Allied advantage is a production rate of a factor of more than 4 to 1. For aircraft, it's slightly more, it's more than 2 to 1. And for aircraft carriers, it's by a factor of more than 9 to 1. And for other surface warships, the ratio is in favor of the Allies by 7 to 1. So these are, I could have cited all sorts of other different numbers about different types of raw materials, about oil production, what have you, right? Now, these numbers are a little rough. What about quality? What about, can the British really use all those hundreds of millions of people in India the same way the Germans can use their own population? No, and so on. We'll get into some of those ideas. But this is the basic thrust of why the numbers get so much attention. And usually when there's talk of these numbers, people will say, well, if Germany doesn't win by 1941, then it's inevitable, that very dangerous word in history, inevitable.
Oh God, yes.
All historians are allergic, or possibly should be allergic, to the word inevitable. But I'm going to give us a little teaser, and then I'll flip it over to you to get your thoughts, and we can start getting into things here. But one of the points that I think critics of a pure numbers explanation get right is they point to certain instances, certain very important moments in the war or periods in the war where this numbers game, if you look at it over the period of 39 to 45 or 37 to 45, yeah, it's overwhelming. But at the Battle of Midway, which could have sent the Pacific War in a different direction, the US does not have an absolutely crushing numbers advantage whatsoever. If you look at the Battle of Britain, which could have had a major impact on the war in Europe, even though Germany probably wouldn't have had a good time invading if they'd tried, but still, it's a significant clash. The British don't have a 2 or a 2.5 to 1 advantage in fighters throughout the whole Battle of Britain. And of course, the US economy isn't even in the war until directly. It's not directly into the war until December 1941. So what about the 2 years before? I mean, there are these cracks that start to appear in the facade of the pure numbers explanation. There are many more, and that's pretty much what we're going to get into today. Did I miss something there? Or do you feel like the numbers game also has its, stones can be cast?
They absolutely can be. There is, of course, as you said, there's a kernel of truth in all of this. If you don't have any men, if you don't have enough tanks, enough planes, you've talked about the numbers, and you've given us some idea here. If you don't have any of this, then of course you're not going to win a war. And yes, it's very, very obvious that at the end of the war, the Allies simply have far more of everything. But as we'll explore as we go through this particular episode of our series, I think there are some other very, very important reasons as to why the Allies win. It's not only numbers, even though the German accounts always talk about the majority or the superiority of man and material of the Allies on all fronts. But there are other reasons. And you already talked about some of these crunch points. And I think you're absolutely right. When you look at the history of the war, you have a relatively slow build-up towards this superiority in man and material on the Allied side. And of course, you already mentioned it. It really, really comes into play the moment the US enters the war. We've talked about this in the previous podcast. The Americans, you might argue, are at war before war's actually being declared. But really, the industrial output really reaches skyrockets and goes through the roof the moment the US enters the war. And that really is a huge changer. But when you look at the campaigns before that, it's not necessarily the case. Yes, in France, the Allies have more men and material, but some of the other campaigns, that's not necessarily true. Particularly when you look at the overall and the overarching numbers. And the Germans, of course, have an advantage here, you might say. On the one hand, there's a disadvantage because they are fighting, for most of the war, a 2 or even more front war. So that makes it very, very difficult. This comes back to this idea that you have to spread yourself very, very thin, and you're basically going to get overwhelmed by the enemy. On the other hand, the Germans also have an advantage because they and their allies can move and operate along interior lines, which means they can shift troops, for example, from the Western Front to the Eastern Front. And you see this being played out during the entire war. When you have 2 or more front war, they do it constantly, shifting troops and people along material. And that makes it possible for them, while they are still numerically weaker, to still be very, very strong at the decisive point. And that really, really matters. It's not important that you're strong everywhere. As, my great hero, I think I've mentioned him in every episode so far, even though he's got absolutely nothing to do with World War II. But Frederick the Great, he once said, "He who wants to defend everything defends nothing." And that is very, very true. So it doesn't matter. You have to see territory. You have to accept that you're going to, if you're fighting a defensive war, that you're going to lose territory somewhere. But you need to be strong where it really, really matters. And the Germans are quite good at this. When you go through the different campaigns and the battles that they fight, they are good at this. The Allies are getting much better as well. And you might say, in many respects, that, of course, is the problem for the Germans. Because, as you said, the idea being, many people have said this, that if the Germans don't really win the war by 1941, they've they probably have lost. I mean, it's this big debate about turning points, and we probably should have another episode about this as well, because there are 2 or 3 or 4. And of course, you already mentioned Asia as well. You've got exactly the same issue, problem, if this is what you want to call it, there as well. Say the Axis powers are suffering from the same problems, whereas the Allies are also suffering, but as the war progresses, they get stronger, and the number of other reasons and issues and problems in both camps. So maybe we can have a look at some of these as well.
Yeah, one of the factors I think that plays a role, one of the themes in a way or aspects of producing for warfare, essentially, is about efficiency. And if you're the side that doesn't have quite as many resources or that doesn't have quite as many troops, you're probably going to have to be more efficient with how you use those resources than the other side if you're going to have a chance at carrying the day, achieving your goals, winning the war, forcing some sort of compromise peace that saves your core conquest or what have you, whatever outcome you might think that the Axis might have been going for at any different point in the war. And in terms of efficiency, this is a problem. The Axis is not particularly efficient, and the Allies, although they struggle, there's no question they have their struggles with efficiently using their massive resources, they eventually get pretty good at it. And some of the examples that I think of is the recovery of the Soviet economy after it was absolutely torched in 1941, and even well into 1942. They're still trying to piece back together their economy, not only to produce weapons. Of course, they famously disassembled and shipped some factories back deeper into the Soviet hinterland. Some of those ended up mismatched and not being able to put together. So there's a bit of a myth about how well that worked. But nonetheless, they are able, often through horrific means, of course, of forced labor and using people in the gulags and all that kind of stuff, but they are able to recover economically, get enough food to their people, and outproduce the Germans in most land warfare weapon systems. Tanks, artillery, they significantly outproduce the Germans. And they do it with less. They do it with less steel. They do it with less machine tools. They don't have some of the technological advantages that German industry has, and they still manage to do it. Now, part of the reason for that, of course, is the help from Lend-Lease. I mean, they get massive amounts of help. They don't want to admit it after the war, during the Cold War. And many Russians, especially in the current state of affairs, don't want to admit that either. But it was certainly the case. And one of the ways they did it, which the Americans also used, was simplicity of design for a lot of their weapon systems. So for the Allies, you have, of course, the T-34 and the Sherman and all their variants, upgun T-34-85s or Shermans with all sorts of different engineering capabilities and so on and so forth. More than half of Allied tanks are Shermans or T-34s. The Germans, on the other hand, they've got all sorts of different tank models. They spread their engineering resources 8 ways from Sunday. They're developing 78 different things at the same time while using French trucks because they don't have enough trucks, et cetera, et cetera. At different times in the war, the Panzer II was the most numerous tank in the field. The Panzer III was the most numerous tank in the field. The Panzer IV was the most numerous tank in the field. And then at some stage, the Panzer V, the Panther, was the primary tank in the field. And that's a big contrast to your good old, reliable, flexible, simple Sherman and T-34s, which were way easier to repair as well.
I think that is one of the main issues and main points that you find on the German side. So coming back to the point of efficiency and repairing, maintenance, and I think you still have the same problem today. Just imagine you go and buy a German car, and then, well, at some point a warning light comes on, and you take it to the garage, and they tell you that the whatever is broken. You didn't even know that it existed, and it was there, and it's going to cost you an arm and a leg to repair it. So this is very much German engineering. It's over-engineered. And you can see exactly the same thing with tanks and all the other equipment that they have. Very, very cleverly designed, very nicely thought through, but quite often not really suitable for mass production in a total war. And that really is one of the fundamental problems that you find. And you already mentioned the Sherman, you mentioned the T-34. They can just outproduce them because they are so simple. And of course, you had, even in the Allied camp, you had these different statistics and ideas. In order to knock out a Tiger or a Panther, you probably have to lose 3 or 4 Shermans, and you accept this, which is not particularly nice for the crews, as you can imagine. But if you go back to the numbers that you mentioned earlier, it's always 4-1. If you play then this number game, yes, it's really going to work. And of course, this is putting the German economy on a lot of stress, a lot of issues and problems. And just think about resupply. Even today, we hear a lot about resupply issues, for example, in the Ukraine, because they've got all these different tanks, they've got different guns. Where do you get the ammunition from? So it's basically pretty much the same problem that the Germans are facing at that particular stage. And also, to add to all of this, not only do they always pursue armament projects that you might say are very, very useful, but very often they also have these scientific hobby horses. And they use a lot of resource to produce these and to research them. Probably the most famous ones, I would say, it's probably the V1 and the V2. Now, you might say, yes, of course, they were very impressive, and why they sent them to London, Antwerp, and they did a lot of damage. But of course, they didn't win the war. So here, folks, is another spoiler. A weapon system, a wonder weapon, never, ever wins a war. Whatever people tell you, one weapon system does not change the outcome of a war. And that's exactly the same thing here. So it's a huge problem. And you look at the resource that was pumped into it. And of course, Werner von Braun, he was very happy. Probably not least because, of course, after the war, he could then become the founding father of the American space program and send American rockets into space. If you're a fan of Tintin, by the way, Tintin on the moon, well, just look at the rocket, that's a V2. So they're flying in a V2 rocket all the way to the moon. So you can see there are these cultural links there as well. But of course, from a pure military point of view, wouldn't it have been much, much better to use all these resources, the money and everything else that they used for these hobby horses, these rockets, to pump all of this into, for example, the production of more fighters, or even for fighter jets, the Me-262, for example. It's a constant problem on the German side. To a degree, it's driven by this whole idea of engineering, German engineering supposed to be the best, and they really do enjoy doing this and like doing that. On the other hand, and again, you've already alluded to it, of course, also it's a consequence of having conquered large parts of Europe. And that means you keep the production plants running. So in 1940, the most numerous tank in the German army is the Czech tank, which they call the T-38, in brackets T for Czechoslovakia. So you get that as well. And of course, that means you've got an eclectic mix of material and things and stuff that the Germans have to deal with, which is a pure logistician's nightmare. So that's a huge problem that you find. And when you talk about the production as well, yes, Germans are very good at engineering, but German industry at that stage is not like America. America really is the powerhouse of the world. You go back to look at what Ford does and the production and the belts that they've got. The Germans don't really have that. So their efficiency as per worker is actually quite low. And also, up to 1943, when Goebbels in his famous speech declares that Germany is now at total war. Do you want it more total than you can ever imagine? Listeners, you've probably seen this or heard this before, this very, very famous speech. Up to that stage, even for the workers, in inverted commas, life in Germany was actually relatively easy, very much inverted commas.
For German workers.
But it's only German workers, absolutely, yes. So if you just look at the hours that they were working, all these things, this is not really total war. So the output, even there per worker, is relatively limited. And again, you find similar things when you look at Japan, for example. The industrial base is quite limited. You look at the industrial output that they have; it's not particularly good. Now, you might argue and debate: do they need a lot of tanks the way they fight? Because we know, and you mentioned aircraft carriers. You talked about the Navy a lot, because for them it's more about naval output. Of course, that are also being outproduced. Their ships are quite good, but you can see there are similar issues both in the Western Axis camp, but also in the Far East. So all sorts of issues coming together. And it's interesting because we said it's not about numbers, but now we've talked about numbers quite a lot and efficiency that goes with these numbers. So maybe we need to look at other things than numbers, because otherwise we're beginning to undermine our own argument here, and that wouldn't be very good and clever. So Jesse, please do come up with something else that's not related to numbers, or at least not saying that numbers were all important.
No, I'm confident that we can differentiate between absolute numbers and efficiency. So yes, we're counting beans, but not all beans are created equal. And I think that's what gets lost in the purely statistical interpretation. If you look at the efficiency of who's using what resources to produce what kinds of weapon system with those resources, that's kind of where we can break down that number argument. But if we want to take a step back and we want to look at some completely different aspects, there's this very debatable, very discussable concept of a decisive front. Was there a decisive front in the Second World War? It's talked about a lot. We've mentioned it, I think, in our very first episode of the podcast about myths, that there's a myth that, one front was decisive and one wasn't, and so on and so forth. But let's say, for the sake of argument, for our purposes here today, and talking about trying to explain Allied victory, let's assume that there is a decisive front. Most would probably argue that it's the Eastern Front. Some make the argument that it's the air-sea front across the globe. There's one particular historian, O'Brien is his name, he says, mobility is the key to warfare, like strategic mobility. And because the Allies on the air and on the sea stop German and Japanese strategic and operational mobility, and they interrupt their logistics being supplied everywhere, that's the decisive front. Whichever way you want to go with that, the Allies win. So if we accept the idea of a decisive front, which I kind of partly don't, in the East or on the air and sea across the globe, the Allies win where it counts. So you can have superior numbers in other places, whichever other front, but it doesn't matter if at the decisive spot, to slightly twist the German concept, at the Schwerpunkt, let's say, at the critical point, you lose.
And isn't it good that we're using German words again, because Schwerpunkt sounds so much better than point of main effort. Let's just face it. Well, you just have to use German terminology when you talk war. Otherwise, it just simply does not work. And that is absolutely right. And of course, you also need to look at these different fronts. Again, are we accepting that there is a decisive one, yes or no? It's a debate that has been going on since actually during the war. When the Soviets said, to the Allies, you need to open a second front because we are fighting here against the Germans on land. And the Allies saying, we already have a second front. Actually, we've got two second fronts, as you said. That's the battle in the Atlantic, and that's the air war. And so they're all related. They're all intermixed. You can't really look at one without the other. If you just look at the Air Force, Germany loses air superiority or supremacy first, then superiority on the Eastern Front, probably in 1943. Because the vast majority of their fighter planes are now being sent to the West to shoot down Allied bombers as they're coming over and across to Germany. So that is really a big problem for, in that case, the Germans. And again, you could say, if you bring it over to the Far East, you've got the same thing there. So what is the decisive front here? So is it the sea front, the sea battles? Because this is quite often what we concentrate on in the Far East. In the Far East, it's all about the naval component. We know about Midway, we know about the aircraft carriers. Whereas in Europe, we tend to concentrate very much on the different aspect, and that is the land war. And that, of course, means the Eastern Front. But it's only when you put these two together. And of course, that's also how they saw that in those days. Yes, the Allies had the Germany first strategy, but they still knew that they had to defeat the other enemy as well. And there you've got the same issues being played out. Is it all about the sea? No, because there are things happening on land as well. Again, terribly sorry to say this to the British listeners now, but the fall of Singapore is probably one of the most drastic, astonishing victories for the Japanese, defeat for the British in the history of warfare. How this huge fortress could fall so quickly is absolutely astonishing, with all the operational and you might say also strategic implications that this has. So it's all intermixed, it's all interdependent, and that makes the whole thing so very, very complicated when you're trying to talk of one particular Schwerpunkt, particularly when you think about it in the strategic sense. It's much easier to talk about the tactical level. Yes, I've got battalion that attacks somewhere, it's pretty obvious what the enemy's point of main, or your point of main effort, and the enemy's weak point is. It might be even possible to do that at the operational level. At the strategic level, you've got so many different factors that come into play, including things that we've all talked about, and that's production, that's efficiency, which makes it really, really, really difficult to decide where you have the most important part. So these are my thoughts on all of this, particularly the different fronts and all these related issues. So Jesse, what do you think?
Well, while you were talking, I just had a random thought. It was something I wanted to mention, and forgive me, Matthias, but we're going to go back to numbers for 1 second here.
There we go.
Because again, numbers are not all created equal, right? How do you achieve an advantage in the numbers that matter? And there are examples in history of an outnumbered side winning a battle, winning a campaign, winning a war. So it's not so deterministic. Japan defeats Russia in 1904-05, and they definitely are smaller in every way, economically, industrial base, the size of their armed forces, and so on and so forth. So there's no question that we have other patterns that exist, that can exist, and we have to keep those in mind today. One of them, of course, is about the actual fighting. It's war, so it's a hot war. This means there's going to be a sharp end up against a sharp end. And how does that play out? One of the things that I find interesting about trying to think about the way that World War II is fought in its different phases, because of course, the fighting in 1939 is not the same as the fighting in 1945. There are quite significant changes. I think that over the course of the war, although the Germans are still relatively effective on the battlefield when they're losing the second half of the war, the Allies improve more than the Germans do in the way that they fight, the way that they fight the kind of war that World War II is. I think it's clear that the Germans are better at first, right? We've talked quite a bit about some of the earlier campaigns, especially in France on the podcast so far. They obviously are able to overcome their enemies. But in the end, the Allies are the ones who are maybe a little bit more, they adapt a little bit better in terms of how they project their force, potential force onto the battlefield. One example that kind of comes to mind is that the Soviets in 1942, they completely, in the midst of the huge crisis, right, where they've lost a third of their empire, they've lost a third of their population, they've lost most of their industrial base, their society and economy and military are all on the edge of collapse, some have argued, in 1942. And they completely restructure their mechanized forces to create tank armies on the hoof, so to speak, on the go. And this is a pretty impressive achievement. They're then able to integrate all of this stuff they get from the Brits and especially from the US in Lend-Lease to allow the Red Army to become far more mobile in the second half of the war than it was at the beginning, so they can use their doctrine of deep battles. So they can apply that against the Germans because they have a similar doctrine. They try to do it in 1941, it just doesn't work. But then it starts working. And it wouldn't work just because of numbers. It works because they're better organized, they're more experienced, and they're able to use these resources that they have efficiently.
And that, of course, is exactly what you don't see on the German side. So the German army is actually becoming, in many ways, less professional as the war progresses. It's not better equipped. It actually, in many ways, you might say the German army demodernizes as the war goes on. And that is mainly because of these huge losses that they sustain. And German industry simply can't produce enough tanks and vehicles and everything that you need to keep the army moving, to keep the army marching. There's always this very wrong image that people have when we talk about the German army in the Second World War. Whenever you talk about the German army doing whatever, everybody's got these huge Tiger tanks, Tiger 1, probably a King Tiger because they're even bigger in their heads, and they're rolling across, and you've got hundreds of thousands of them. No. You have a spearhead army, you might say, of a very limited number of divisions. These is very well equipped. They've got the new kit, the new stuff, the nice and fancy and shiny tanks. The vast majority of the army, however, that's infantry divisions. And they march into battle as their fathers had done in the First World War and their grandfathers had done, and their grandfathers had done in 1870-71. probably the most mechanized, the most modern army on the whole across the board in the early days of the Second World War is probably the British Army, because it is quite small. So it has a very, very high number of vehicles, probably the only pretty much fully motorized army that you do find. The German army does not fit that mold at all. You just need to look at, for example, the number of horses that the Germans use when they go into the East in 1941. It's about 500,000 horses, because the army is relying on horses. It's not relying on fancy, shiny vehicles and tanks. So that's one of the issues. And then you've got these massive losses. First of all, in materiel. We'll return to the man in a minute. And that causes issues, which is also one of the reasons why in 1943, 1944, when the German army is defending against the Soviets, they come up with this idea which really goes against everything you think what the German army stands for in World War II, which is mobile warfare, operations into the enemy rear, blitzkrieg. We talked about this in a different episode. And in 1943, 1944, they decide that they're now going to have a static defense. So they're going to have fortified places on the Eastern Front. And after the war, the general said, of course, that was Hitler's idea. Well, how stupid was that? Again, the Manstein idea, the lost victories. If we had fought the war we wanted to and could have fought, we might have won the war in the East. Well, actually, when you look at what the generals say at that particular time, so during the war, most of them are in favor, because they realize they will not be able to withdraw, i.e. run away quickly enough from this more and more motorized Soviet army, and they'd just be overrun. So you can see there's a massive problem that you find here in the German army. And of course, another thing when you talk about losses, if you just look at the manpower, there's also a big problem. So the German army, just to throw out one number here, between 1941, so the 22nd of June, when they invade the Soviet Union, and May 1944, they lose about 1.85 million men killed or captured on the Eastern Front alone. The Eastern Front is the big killer. About 80% of casualties occur there. That is a lot of people. And these are, of course, the experienced one. You still have some of the peace-trained soldiers. So they are good. They know what they're doing. They're the professionals in some respects. The people are then drafted in and thrown into the front line. These are the fresh recruits. After a very short basic training, they are sent to the front line, and a lot of them die because they don't know what they're doing and how they need to behave. You can also see this when you look at, for example, at the Air Force. We talked about the Air Force a little bit, trying to shoot down the Allied bombers as they're coming across. So when you look at the losses of German fighter pilots between January and May 1944, the German Air Force loses nearly 99% of its fighter pilots. That is a lot. If that's not a lot, I don't know what is. And of course, that means all the experienced ones are practically gone. And you're now throwing into battle these fighter pilots who now have very, very fancy and shiny planes. They're very, very good, going back to the over-engineered bit we were talking about earlier. But these guys have no training. And it's interesting when you look at the accounts from the Allies to say how easier it's getting as you go through the war towards the end to shoot down German pilots, because they're simply not trained anymore. So there's another, and that is, you might say, the flip side of all of this and all of the losses. So it's all to do with quality. And that is the big problem that the Germans are suffering at that particular time. They still have numbers in 1944, 1945, millions of people in the armed forces, but the quality is going down. And that, of course, also means that the Allies, with the exception of the Soviets, the Allies are losing less men than the Germans. So they've got this learning curve, and they can retain this learning curve because these people don't die to the same degree as the Germans do. And you combine this, the increase in quality, whether it's material, but also the fighting ability of particularly the Western Allies, with the declining ability on the German side, and that shows you why the Allies, in the end, are actually outmaneuvering, outthinking, outwitting the army, outfighting the army, particularly at the operational level of war. Which is interesting, because very often when you get people who are in admiration and awe of what the Germans do, everybody kind of stops looking at the German army after 1943, perhaps 1944, perhaps there's a bit of Monte Cassino going on, a bit of what they did in Normandy in the initial phases. No one really looks at late 1944 or early 1945, because that army, that Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, is not what it had been in 1941, 1942, perhaps even 1943.
I mean, this reminds me of a couple of other examples where I mean, the German army grows quite substantially. I think it reaches its peak strength in 1943. It's not winning in 1943, right? Because of these quality issues that you talked about, and because its enemies are not only getting stronger, but they're getting smarter, they're getting more efficient, they're getting better at doing the things that the Germans had been doing to them before. The Battle of the Atlantic, I think, has some of this because German submarine production increases up until 1944. Like aircraft production also increases. You mentioned the Air Force, right? They have more planes in 1943-44 than they did in 1940, but they're losing because they don't have the pilots. Well, in the Atlantic, in 1940, for example, there's a period of time called the happy time because the British escorts don't know what they're doing, and a relatively small number of German subs is able to not quite sink at will, but they have a very productive time of it. Sinking warships, sinking capital ships, sinking merchantmen, sinking cargo vessels. But what happens? The British are better at innovating and adapting in the Atlantic War. Even though the Germans have many more subs in 1944 than they do in 1940, they have lost that battle. They are not making such a dent in Allied naval and merchant marine strength because the British have better convoy tactics, better escort tactics. They're developing new technology all the time. And the Germans are just slower. They're just left behind.
And I think this technology aspect is absolutely key and crucial. And we haven't really talked about this, but I think it's really, really important. And yes, you're absolutely right. You look at the Battle of the Atlantic, so sonar or statistic, depending on whether you're British or American, whatever you want to call it. Well, that became the big fear and fright of the German U-boat commanders. You have the same during the Battle of Britain, the radar that they used. Well, the Germans had it as well, but the British one was far more advanced. It was much better. One of the reasons why some of the Germans, when you read the accounts, say, it's not going to make any difference because it's no good. Well, the German one wasn't that good at that time. It gets much better as you go through the war, but the British one was always very good. So it's also a war of technology. And of course, what you do find is that, yes, Germany is the country of engineering in those days. It's the country of the Nobel Prizes. I don't know the exact figure, but I think a third of them up to the First War went to Germany or the German-speaking world. But of course, they lose the edge here quite a bit after 1933 because a lot of scientists, because they've got Jewish roots, well, they leave and they don't come back. And the best example and perhaps the embodiment of this, of course, of this brain drain and what it means is, of course, it's the ultimate weapon that is being developed in World War II. And that, of course, is the nuclear bomb. When you look at the history of it, there is a lot of German input. And of course, the Allies were worried that the Germans might get there first and build it. Hitler kind of loses interest in the whole project, so it doesn't really happen. But at one stage, you might say, I wouldn't say they were winning that race, but if they had invested more energy and thought rather than trying to over-engineer some V1s and V2s, that might have changed the course of the war. And it sounds quite drastic and quite brutal, but in some ways, Germany and its allies in Europe can only be glad and happy that they surrendered early enough in May 1945, and they were spared the fate of Japan, where, of course, we do have these two nuclear bombs being dropped. That, of course, opens a completely new phase and era of warfare, one which, well, we're still in today. So that, you might say, is the prime example of the impact and influence and importance of technology. There are, of course, other areas as well. If you want to go into deciphering, that's also very scientific. You look at the ultras, so the Allies being able to read the German order. So there are quite a few of these areas where the Allies were leading. And the Germans realized this, so they knew that the Allies were pretty good at this. So everything to do with technology, they were good. And the Germans quite often were playing catch-up. And that, of course, cost them dearly.
Yeah, mentioning Enigma makes me think of the naval war again. I'm not a naval guy, by the way, at all. I'm kind of a bit...
You're not in the Navy?
I'm never in the Navy, never would want to be, I don't think. I'm a little bit nervous around the ocean. My grandfather thought about joining the Navy, and then he joined the Army instead in the Second World War. And when they sailed across to England for training in February 1941, it was a huge storm, and he was so seasick. He told me, I was so glad I hadn't joined the Navy when I took that across the transatlantic trip. But what it made me think of was the Mediterranean situation. Yeah. And here again, we can see the Italians have a lot more ships than what the British can spare during some significant parts of the Mediterranean War. but they're not able to rule the Mediterranean. Why? Because they're not as good as the British are. So there's another case where it's not just the brute numbers. Otherwise, Italy, the Mediterranean should have been a lake for them at these critical phases of the war. And the other thing I'd been thinking about related to combat is logistics. And there, the Germans just don't put enough resources into it. They go in, especially in the invasion of the Soviet Union, their fleet of trucks is an absolute hodgepodge of seized French and Czechoslovak machines and all sorts of stuff. They don't have the right lubricants for their vehicles once it starts to get cold. They don't have enough winter uniforms. Now, this is not purely a logistical issue in those two last examples. It's also kind of a hubris issue. It's also a sort of ideological issue, perhaps. We'll come to ideology in a few moments. But I think on the whole, the Germans are just not good enough at logistics. They just don't prioritize logistics enough. This was one of the big problems that Rommel had for all his operational skill. And even then, of course, there's a bit of a myth about Rommel, I think. But he did certainly perform well in North Africa on multiple occasions and beat the British in the field. But if you're not getting the fuel that you need, if you're not getting the oil that you need, if you're not getting the ammunition that you need, if the size of your force is so limited because you can't get enough to keep it going, then somebody somewhere is making the wrong decision about the priority of logistics. And I think the Germans suffered from that far more often than the Allies did.
It's a structural flaw in the German system. You are absolutely right. And of course, you can explain this at least to a degree when you look at the way the Germans want to fight. This whole idea of the boxing match and you having to knock out the enemy in the first round. So everything that you've got, you put into the teeth arm. So you need more guns and tanks because these are going to whack the enemy. And hopefully, in a short, quick campaign, you're going to win. In a short, quick campaign, potentially you don't even have to mobilize the entire population. It can keep output and production relatively low. And that, of course, has an impact on logistics as well. Whereas the Allies fight very, very different. In logistics, yes, is very, very much throughout history, you might say, the weak spot of the German military. And it's very interesting when you read the German accounts when they encounter particularly the Western Allies and see how much materiel they've got and planes, or even just simple things like rations, what they're being fed and what their uniforms look like and how much of everything they've got, they are completely gobsmacked. And it's in many respects, it's war on a shoestring that the Germans run.
And the Japanese are even worse because, I mean, they just expect a lot of especially their island garrisons to just make do, to just exist on a few handfuls of rice a day at some point. So I think they also really make an assumption about the relative importance of logistics that comes around to bite them in the behind and results in a contribution to their battlefield defeats, but that also limits them strategically, that they'll make a strategic decision and then they can't do what they want to do in the field because of logistical problems partially. So I really think there's a kind of cascade effect to the logistical issue as well. But on the topic of strategy, that makes me think of leadership, which I think is another area where if you weigh it out, I'm not talking about pure military leadership and command. I think that's a much more discussable topic. And maybe you feel differently, but I don't think that's where you go when you're trying to decide who wins the war. It's more about the overall political and strategic leadership. And there, I think the Allies definitely come out on top. Now, if you're comparing the leaders of the main players here, let's say, I feel like if you look at it from a sort of bird's eye view, you can sort of say, well, look, the Allies have more success overcoming their ideological differences because, of course, for the Americans and British to work with the Soviets and vice versa is not obvious. It's not easy. The Germans didn't think that it was going to really be a possibility, for example. Many other people didn't think that way. Some Brits and Soviets were not so keen about it. But Churchill and Roosevelt, in spite of being fervently anti-communist themselves, especially Churchill, much more Churchill, he makes the clear decision, look, we've got to work with them to win this war. We have to work with the lesser evil to overcome the greater evil of the Axis. And that's the kind of decision that really takes a lot of pragmatism, flexibility, and partially courage as well. I mean, on the other hand, you could say it's a no-brainer. What else are you going to do? But you could do something else. You do have a choice. You could have said, well, Lend-Lease, no, we're not going to give it to them. We're going to let them fight on their own, for example. And Roosevelt did face resistance to sending material to the Soviet Union, especially at first, and stuck with it. So the Grand Alliance, as Churchill called it, their disagreements, and there are, of course, disagreements between the Brits and the Americans as well. Should they concentrate on the Mediterranean? Should they rush to invade France, as the Americans kind of wanted to do? The Americans always suspicious about the British wanting to keep their empire, and they don't agree about the importance of Burma. All sorts of disagreements, but it doesn't stop the Grand Alliance from identifying that common strategic priority to defeat Germany first, because it's the greatest threat, and making sacrifices, making compromises, gritting their teeth, grinning and bearing it when they have to, all of them, and getting on with the job. And the Axis is not able to do that kind of thing.
That is very true. And the reason for that is because, at least in Europe, Hitler is so much the strongest partner, leader, the Führer, whatever you want to call it, of all these Axis countries, that he basically dictates what is happening. And of course, he's very much driven by his own ideology. So it's not always sanity that drives him, but different things. And that makes it very, very difficult. And when you then look at perhaps the two potential strong partners that he really has, well, that is Mussolini and potentially, even though it doesn't really work in the end, it might have been Franco. Franco doesn't join the war. He makes that very, very clear. Yes, he sends a division to fight on the Eastern Front, the Blue Division, but that's very much it. And the Italians, under Mussolini, very, very quick to become the junior partner, even though Hitler had this admiration for Mussolini and Italy because that had been the first fascist country. So you can see how these personal ideas and the personal ideology of Hitler really drive his political thinking. And this is really a big difference when you compare the European Axis countries to the Allies. You already talked about Poland. It's always quite interesting. I've used this example a number of times in discussions also with military personnel. So when you look at why the Allies declare war on Germany in 1939, it's because they have said, well, we guarantee the existence of a free, democratic, independent Poland. So when Germany invades Poland in 1939, shouldn't the Western Allies also have declared war on the Soviet Union? Of course, they don't. The real reason, you've already mentioned it, because they thought, you know what, we can't really fight two empires and that's lesser evil. The political explanation at the time, of course, was that the Soviets just went in there to protect the Polish minority and their own minorities in eastern Poland rather than occupying the country. So you can see there's all these things happening. You fast forward to early 1945, the Germans have been driven out of Poland. The Soviets are there. They have established a puppet regime. Everybody can see this is not a democratic country. According to your 1939 ideas, this is now time to probably make peace with the Germans and declare war on the Soviet Union. Of course, it doesn't happen because a lot of stuff has happened in between, but you can see how these coalitions are much more down-to-earth, raison d'être, realpolitik, as the term goes. So they look at what is happening, what is it that we can really achieve, whereas Hitler is driven by his ideology. You mentioned Germany first. Again, a very conscious decision by the Allies. Germany is the most important enemy, the biggest enemy, so we need to feed Germany first, and then we can look to the east. When you look at how the Axis powers cooperate, well, they hardly do. There's a little bit of interaction, particularly between Germany and Japan in the run-up to the war against America. So who should Japan declare war on? Should they go against Russia or the Soviet Union or perhaps against the US? So they talk about this. But apart from that, these are very, very, you might say, independent wars. They don't really interact. Even when you go to Europe, when you look at the whole Balkans experience, when you look at why you mentioned Rommel, why they go into Africa, is because the Italians are not as successful in their campaigns as they want to be. Hitler had never planned this, but he needs to bail out the Allies, or his ally, which is Italy. So completely moving away from his strategic aim of defeating the Soviet Union. So there's no really joined-up planning. So things like what you see in the Allied camp, the conferences of the big three, Yalta, Casablanca, all these ones, you don't see them. People go to Hitler, he dictates what he wants, and then they go away again. And that's very much it. So this is not a coalition warfare. And that, of course, in the long run, well, you might say cheeses off people and countries. One of the reasons probably why the coalition then completely falters and collapses in the excess camp, because people see that there's a better way out. Of course, the military reality in 1944-45 also plays a role, but I think they're all factors that do come together. What do you think?
Well, I think the chaos on the Axis side exists on multiple levels as well. It exists in terms of the international alliance, as you referred to, right? So Germany attacks the Soviet Union at the same time that Japan has just signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Japan doesn't tell Germany that it's going to attack Pearl Harbor, for example, in advance. You think if you're trying to coordinate strategy, you might do that a little bit differently. Or Italy invaded Greece without informing Germany, and then they have to do what you just said and distract themselves and go off course and lose sight of their main strategic goal. And then within the Axis systems, in their countries, in their bureaucracies, now I'm going to get to be a little bit boring here in terms of administration and bureaucracy and committees. You mentioned conferences. This stuff is not unimportant. This is a massive conflict that is so complex, that involves so much industry, so much transportation, so much technology. You need to manage it effectively. And for that, you need bureaucratic institutions in your military and in civilian life, and they have to all be coordinated, and they have to be then coordinated with your allies. The allies are able to do this much better. They, for example, have the combined chiefs of staff for the British and the Americans, and many, many other different kinds of committees. The Axis, each of them, of course, they do have some committees, but like the Germans in particular, there's infighting. The SS wants to get more influence, or then you have Nazi party members vying for influence against, regular state bureaucrats and so on and so forth. So the Japanese Army-Navy rivalry, which is far more damaging than any inter-service rivalry on the Allied side, right? The Navy doesn't even tell the Army how bad its losses were after the Battle of Midway. I mean, that is a very, very serious problem that you're having, and they're never able to resolve this problem. And because they're not democracies, now, of course, the Soviets are also not a democracy, but if we're going to compare with the British and the Americans at least, you can have Hitler or Mussolini or Tojo make or impose a decision. Not that they always did this, but they could much more easily impose a bad decision about a critical topic or at a critical moment without as much pushback that an institution or a representative committee could have done in the British and American case. And even perhaps the Soviets did also have some success in committees, planning, and so on and so forth. It didn't come from the same democratic kind of culture as it did in Britain and the US, but it was far better than what the Japanese, Italians, or Germans brought to the table. I don't know how Germans usually also are known not only for engineering, but for bureaucracy. So how do you feel about the bureaucratic topic?
Well, you can't beat a good bureaucracy. That is very, very true. You need to have it. That is very, very Germanic. You're absolutely right. And yes, it is confusing. It was confused. It was muddled. So we already talked about German over-engineering. So probably you might say the bureaucratic system was also over-engineered, because you had different factions. You already mentioned it, the in-house fighting between these different systems, these different ideas. So you do find that. And for example, you just break it down to the military. Even in the military, there was no strict, coherent chain of command. It was very and extremely muddled. Again, it goes against everything that you might think about the German army and German efficiency. Just look at the high command. So who's in charge of the war and how do you coordinate this? So at the strategic level, the Germans did not have a joint doctrine. So the different services are doing their own thing, just as you mentioned earlier, same with the Japanese. So the Germans work on a joint doctrine in a newly found war academy, which they close just before the outbreak of the war. There's a draft of this doctrine, but it never gets issued. So they're all doing their own thing. Who's in charge of running the wars? Well, basically, you've got two high commands that are in charge of running the war. You've got the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, that is responsible, in theory, for running the entire war, because it's the Wehrmacht, it's all services brought together. That makes sense. However, it's not in charge of running the war on the Eastern Front. That's the big one. It's a land war. So this goes to the Supreme Command of the Army. So again, you can see there are all sorts of really, really weird decisions that are being taken. And that, of course, means you breed bureaucracy. When you look at Paris in 1944, just before D-Day, and you look at how many officials the Germans have in France and in Paris. I mean, let's face it, Paris isn't the worst posting you can get. Once you're there, well, why would you want to be posted to the Eastern Front? You'd be very foolish. However, the accounts tell us that you had about 20,000 soldiers and officials just running Paris and the occupational force in France. Which is really interesting because when the Germans get there in 1940, they run all of France on a shoestring. It's a handful of people because they leave all the French officials in place and just the very, very senior posts, the key posts, are filled with Germans. So but between 1940 and 1944, you can see how this really explodes. And that is a huge, huge problem that you find on the German side. The Allies, as we discussed, much better. And I think really what is really, really important is this thing that you mentioned, this committee, this thought that if someone has a good idea, which might not be so good, within these committees, you might water this down a bit and come to some sort of consensus idea. Churchill is the perfect example. When you look at the people who worked with Churchill, he drew them absolutely crazy because he's this person who also has about 15 good ideas a day. And you don't want a person like Churchill with 15 good ideas. As someone else has said, well, for one good idea, in reality, he had about 5 or 6 bad ideas. By the way, that also applied to his speeches. We don't remember these, we just remember the good stuff. But just imagine having to work with him when he comes up with all these great ideas and trying to talk him out of this. So that really cost particularly Ellenbrook and people like him, well, an awful lot of nerve. Most of the time they succeeded, not always, but this whole committee thing worked much better. You also, of course, to a degree, have the similar setup, not the same, but a similar setup that you find in the Axis camp, because the Americans clearly are, of course, in the driving seat. And that's very obvious and clear by 1943, perhaps you might say. So you've got this in-house fighting as well, but it's done at a different level. At least, well, the facade is still very much amicable, and it's very, very different compared to what happens in the German case. And of course, when you go to the Far East, I mean, the Japanese don't really have an awful lot of allies they can use, official allies. Germany still has countries like Italy or people from Central Europe fighting with them, the unofficial alliance with Spain that we mentioned. The Japanese are very much on their own. They're out there. So they have, on one hand, you might say it's a bit easier, because they don't have to worry about coalition warfare. But on the other hand, it's much, much harder. As the good old saying goes, there's only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that's fighting without.
I like that. I like that saying. It reminds me of quite a few traumatic strategic board gaming experiences that I've had over the years. But one other aspect that I think we want to maybe close on now before we round off this discussion, and that's one where I think it has an impact on both Germany and Japan, is ideology. What role does your overarching ideology have on how you fight, where you fight, what you do when you fight, how you govern the territories that you've conquered, and how does that contribute then to them losing the war? I think this is a fairly significant factor. German brain drain, you already mentioned it earlier in the podcast, right? The Germans lose out on quite a few bright minds because they are German Jews who leave before the war begins. I mean, if you think about the First World War, you have somebody like Walter Rathenau or Fritz Haber. These guys, Rathenau was a minister who really helped keep the German economy going, propped it up with his skills as an administrator during the First World War. Fritz Haber famously invented a procedure to be able to create artificial or to extract nitrates to use as fertilizer so that Germany wouldn't starve as badly as it partly did during the First World War. So he also made a massive contribution. You're not going to have any of those in the Second World War because they've already left or you've put them in a camp somewhere. And this extends, of course, to occupied populations, right? So both the Germans and the Japanese have this idea that they're a superior race, superior to those who they have conquered, whether it be in the Soviet Union, Poland, or the Philippines, or China. And so their harsh treatment of these peoples feeds resistance. It feeds partisan movements. It makes it a lot harder for you to use local elites to administer the territories for you or to extract their resources more efficiently because people are trying to run away or what have you, instead of continuing to work in a relative environment of at least safety, and their boss is still their old boss, but now his boss is a new guy from Germany or Japan or what have you. They don't have that much of that. So they're not able to use the resources of the territories that they've conquered as efficiently as they otherwise could. And they have to divert resources of their own to police these territories more intensely, let's say, because of resistance, be it passive or active partisans and so on. Yes, you might argue they could get free slave labor, and the Germans made particularly massive use of this. The Japanese also made use of it. But slave labor is not efficient. They are not good workers for obvious reasons. And so if you base your empire on that, it's not going to be an efficient empire.
And particularly when you have conquered countries that stand at different, well, let's call it steps or levels of industrialization and development. So you go into France, and that's a very highly industrialized country, just like Belgium. But to go to the east, it's very, very different. You need very different approaches. You need to have a very different structure within that country. How are you going to organize all of this? That makes it really, really difficult. And some of these areas you can only really exploit long term. And of course, the Germans don't have the long term because, first of all, they don't really think it's really important because they just want to kill lots of people in the east because they want to have the living space. By the time they realize that they need to work with these people, it's basically too late. And they can't also change the economy around because that just takes time. So you have this real strange mix of different cultures, different industrial standings, outputs that makes it really, really difficult. And it's easier again, perhaps in the Allied camp, because when you look at America, the US as this powerhouse, supplying to a degree the Soviet Union, but also Britain and the other nations, that makes it all a bit easier to coordinate everything. Well, even there you get some tensions. There are some interesting reports from American troops as they land in the UK in 1942, 1943, how shocked they are by the attitudes of the British trade unions. But the fact that a cargo can't be taken off the ships because, well, someone's on strike or the trade unions don't want to work or things like this, they're really shocked by this. They say this is such a completely different and alien mindset. But compared to the problems that you find in the other camps and in the other countries, these are quite small and can be overcome quite easily. And you find the same issue to a degree when you go to Japan again. So how do you coordinate all these different nations, these different countries? Also then looking at these different factions, anti-colonialism, so all this plays a role as well, makes it really quite difficult for them to coordinate this, particularly if the idea is first to exploit everything because you think that you are racially superior, whether you're Japanese or German. And then, as I said, by the time you realize, we might have to work with them because the war's not really going all that well, it might be a long war, then of course it's too late. And you've cheesed off everybody to such a degree that turning this around is no longer possible.
Absolutely. And if you think about China and the Soviet Union, there's a lot of feelings and a lot of groups of people that you would think a foreign power could work with, right? Who oppose the existing power, the existing situation in the country. So if you look at the Japanese, yes, they're trying to, at the same time as they believe they're racially superior to all the other peoples, including their fellow Asians, they're also trying to sell Asians that they've occupied and others on the idea that they are liberating Asia from Western imperial powers. Well, try selling that idea to the Chinese living in the occupied zone, occupied by the Japanese, when they're using biological weapons and anthrax and plague against them, when they are killing hundreds of thousands in the rape of Nanking in 1937. No one's going to want to work with you. No one's going to support this idea that, oh yeah, the Japanese, sure, we want to be a part of a common Asian independent empire and independent from the Western imperial powers and so on. That's not going to enter anyone's mind. They're like, it's going to be, these people are monsters. We want to get rid of them. And the same thing in the Soviet Union. You have all sorts of minorities there and some great Russian ethnic people as well who don't like the Soviets. The Ukrainians are probably the biggest group of people who really, for the most part, do not like Soviet rule, but also the Baltic peoples as well, who've just been invaded by the Soviet Union a couple of years before. But the Germans are not able, in particular, with the Baltics, they do a little bit more, but with the Ukrainians in particular, there's nothing significant that happens. There are a few, there's one Waffen-SS division, there's a couple of little misunderstandings at the beginning where Ukrainians sometimes think that the Germans will be treating them better and maybe allowing them to have their own state, as they did in 1918 when Germany and Austria-Hungary occupied Ukraine. But that doesn't happen. It's mass repression, exploitation, and slaughter. And so you don't have a Ukraine that becomes a functional kind of second-rate, let's say, allied force to the Germans. It's not possible. And the reason is because of this ideological blinkers that they have on.
So these are really the issues that you find when you look at the European theatre of war. And of course, you find collaborators in every country. You had collaborators in the West, in France, in the Netherlands. You find them on the Eastern Front, for example, in the Ukraine as well. It's actually one of the reasons why today Putin can still go around and say that the Ukrainians are all Nazis and Russia is fighting another war against Nazism. Because to Russian audience, one of the reasons why he says this is because to them, a lot of Ukrainians actually were collaborators fighting against the Soviet forces, but also, of course, while taking part in the Holocaust. So it's a very, very difficult story. And as always in history, he said, well, nothing is always inevitable, the evil inevitable word that we're always trying to avoid. But also, I think another point that is very, very important is that when you look at these things in history, there always tends to be a lot of grey, far more grey than pure black and white. But apart from that, I think everything we've discussed and everything we said about ideology and the problems and the issues that fall out of this one are, of course, absolutely there. And if you had to put your money on it, yes, absolutely. Nazi ideology, racial ideology, the same in the Far East, make it basically impossible to really rule these countries, to get the most out of these countries, in particular, the moment the tide is turned and the war's not going particularly well.
Yeah, I think that's true. On the Ukrainian topic, I would just point out, because it's a topic that, as you mentioned, is used a lot, especially in Russia, but also on certain political scenes in the West, that far more Ukrainians, and I mean far more, fought in the Red Army than ever fought in any collaborationist unit. And of course, there were also ethnic Russians who collaborated with the Nazis. You have a whole formation of them, the Vlasov Army, as it was called. But that was just a quick digression for the sake of clarity. Today, our topic was how the Allies managed to win World War II beyond the pure numbers game. Yes, numbers do matter, but so does, as we discussed, efficiency. So does perhaps, arguably, winning on the decisive front where it matters. So does your ability to adapt and fight in combat in a way that will have results on the battlefield. So do things like leadership, both the big picture, strategic, political leadership, and also the bureaucratic leadership and skills to make committees and make decisions that make sense. And of course, ideology matters, and that crippled the Axis as well. So I hope, listeners out there, that you learned something new, that you've got another angle on an age-old question that is sometimes oversimplified in the public eye. But if you don't agree, or if you do agree, or if you think we missed something, or if you just read the latest book and it's the bee's knees and it said something different than what we said today, let us know, leave us a comment. Until then, we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
That really you should have declared war on the US. Sorry, I'll do that again because that sounds really weird. It's not the US, they're not there yet. When you look at France in 1944, just before the invasion, Paris alone,
1940, I think. Sorry, you said when you look at France in 1944, just before the invasion. Yeah. Didn't you mean 1940? Oh, you mean the Normandy invasion? Oh, sorry.
Ay.
My bad.
I do it again. Yeah. You're
I'm not a naval guy, by the way, at all. I'm kind of a bit.
not in the Navy. In the Navy. Da, 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 da.